Hello and welcome to episode number 67 of A Slice of Medieval. And today we have a returning visitor in Kathryn Warner, who is always a pleasure to talk to. Kathryn holds 2 degrees in medieval history from the University of Manchester. That's a big reader, Kathryn. She is considered a foremost expert on Edward II, and an article from her on the subject was published in the English Historical Review. She has run a website about him since 2005 and a Facebook page about him since 2010, and has carved out a strong online presence as an expert on Edward II and the 14th century in general. Yeah, she's my go-to person on Edward II.
Thank you.
And she recently wrote a wonderful biography of Edward II's grandson, John of Gaunt, who we're here to talk about today. He's another controversial figure of the 14th century, but just absolutely fascinating. So thank you for joining us, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Sharon. I'm really delighted to be here.
Why is John of Gaunt so significant?
Well, if it's okay with you, Sharon, I'd just like to start by putting John of Gaunt into some kind of context and just explaining perhaps to our listeners just exactly, who he was and where he came from and what he was about.
Yeah.
So John of Gaunt was born in March 1340 and was one of the sons of Edward III, who was the King of England from 1327 to 1377, was a grandson of Edward II, great-grandson of Edward I, and so on. So John was born as the son of the King of England, so was royal on his father's side and also on his mother's side. So his mother was Philippa of Hainaut, and her father was the Count of Hainaut in what is now Belgium, and was also Count of Holland in what is now the Netherlands. But on her mother's side, Philippa was the niece of Philip VI, who was the King of France from 1328 to 1350. And Queen Philippa's eldest sister, Margareta, was married to Ludwig of Bavaria, who became the Holy Roman Emperor and ruled massive territories in Europe, most of Germany and Italy and lots of the smaller countries in between them. So a little known fact about John of Gaunt is that he actually had a lot of German cousins, on his mother's side. And as well as that, his father's youngest sibling, Joan of the Tower, was married to David II of Scotland. So when John of Gaunt was born in 1340, his father was the King of England, his great-uncle was the King of France, and both the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Scotland were his uncles-in-law. So he had really illustrious royal connections, to say the least. And from the start of John of Gaunt's life in 1340, we can see an important European dimension to it, I think, which I believe is a key feature of his life, but which is often overlooked. So many people are probably aware that John of Gaunt was the father of Henry IV of England and the grandfather of Henry V, the victor of the Battle of Agincourt. But perhaps many people are not quite so aware that Gaunt was actually the grandfather of 3 kings. So not only Henry V of England, he was also the grandfather of Duarte I, the King of Portugal, and Juan II, King of Castile and Leon in Spain. So Catherine of Aragon, for example, who married Henry VIII as his first wife, was descended from John of Gaunt via both of his daughters, who married into European royalty. So John of Gaunt was the Duke of Lancaster and was therefore, of course, the ancestor of the Lancastrian kings of England in the 15th century, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. But he was also the great-grandfather of the Yorkist kings of England in the 15th century, Edward IV and Richard III, via his daughter Joan Beaufort and her daughter Cecily Neville, Duchess of York. So he's a really important figure in this genealogical sense. He was the ancestor of pretty well everyone important, both in England in the 15th century, but also in Southern Europe. And he had at least 40 grandchildren, to my knowledge. So I think he's the ancestor of pretty well everyone.
I was going to say, he's probably all our ancestors.
We're probably all descended from John of Gaunt. So when John was born in 1340, he was the sixth of his parents' 12 children. So King Edward and Queen Philippa had five daughters and no fewer than seven sons. So John was the fourth son, but the royal couple's second son, William of Hatfield, died in infancy in 1337. So Gaunt was the third eldest of the royal sons to survive. The sixth son, John's younger brother, William of Windsor, also died in infancy. So John of Gaunt was the middle son of the five who lived into adulthood. And he was actually 10 years younger than his eldest brother, Edward of Woodstock, Prince of Wales, better known to history as the Black Prince, though that seems to be a later appellation, possibly not contemporary. It's not recorded until the 16th century. And then there were 15 years between John of Gaunt and his youngest brother, Thomas of Woodstock, who was later Duke of Gloucester, who wasn't born until January 1355 and was much younger than all his siblings. But then on the other hand, the middle three royal sons were all very close in age. So John's older brother, Lionel, was only 15 months his senior, and the next eldest brother, Edmund, was only 15 months younger. And in the 14th century, the English royal family were generally known by their birthplaces. So John's father, Edward III, before he became king, was often known as Edward of Windsor. And John's grandfather, Edward II, was often known as Edward of Carnarvon after his birthplace in North Wales. So John of Gaunt was born in the town of Ghent in what is now Belgium. So Edward III claimed the throne of France in 1337 and then spent most of the period from 1338 to 1340 on the continent, seeking allies against the French. And the main place where he went was what we now call the Low Countries, where there was a kind of a patchwork of small counties and duchies. But despite their small size, the rulers of these places were quite wealthy and influential, and they're therefore very worth courting as allies in Edward III's war against the French. So John's older brother was called Lionel of Antwerp. He later became Duke of Clarence because he was born in Antwerp. But his next brother, Edmund, was born after the Royal English couple had returned to England and was born in King's Langley in Hertfordshire. So therefore he's called Edmund of Langley. So in the 14th century, the town that we call Ghent was called Gaunt. And significantly, Shakespeare writing, a bit more than 200 years later, also called Ghent Gaunt. So the famous first line of his play about Richard II, John of Gaunt's nephew, is "Old John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster." And this name actually does date to John's own lifetime. This was the name that he was known by, in his own lifetime. So correctly in modern English, we probably should technically really call him John of Ghent. But the name John of Gaunt is just so famous. It just seems that it would be a bit weird to start calling him John of Ghent.
I always thought it was that we couldn't pronounce Ghent or people had got it confused. I didn't realise it was originally Ghent was Gaunt.
Yes, yeah.
That makes so much more sense.
Yeah, so that spelling is actually, yes, it is recorded in John of Gaunt's lifetime.
So he's obviously a very powerful man. Why was he a figure of hate for so many people at the time? Was that to do with his power and wealth?
Yes, Derek. Yes, I think you've put your finger on it there. So I think it's beyond all doubt that John was like widely hated and detested in his own lifetime. He just happened to be out of London in 1381 when the peasant revolt kicked off, and I think that was really lucky for him because I think if the mob had caught up with him, that he would probably have ended up with his severed head on the spike, being paraded around London. So John of Gaunt was enormously wealthy and privileged, and I'll just talk about the reasons behind that. So of course, he was born into the English royal family. He was privileged from birth, and he was only 2 years old in 1342 when his father gave him the earldom of Richmond in Yorkshire. So he was already officially an earl and a landowner, even when he was a toddler. And then his position was enhanced even further by the first marriage he made in 1359 when he was 19. And he married a young woman called Blanche of Lancaster, to whom he was related, because she was the great-granddaughter of Edmund of Lancaster, who was the only brother of John of Gaunt's great-grandfather, Edward I. Blanche's father was Henry of Lancaster, who was born around 1310 or 1312, so was almost exactly the same age as Edward III, and was always very close to his royal kinsman, the king, who obviously thought the world of him, because Edward III made Henry the first Duke of Lancaster in 1351. And actually, Henry was only the second English Duke in history, after Gaunt's eldest brother, Edward of Woodstock, who was Prince of Wales and also Duke of Cornwall. So Henry of Lancaster was a really towering figure in the middle of the 14th century, and was, as far as I remember, he was the third member of the Order of the Garter after Edward III and the Prince of Wales. And he was enormously wealthy via inheritance, so that the great bulk of his inheritance came from his father, who was also called Henry of Lancaster. But he also inherited a number of lands from his mother, who died when he was a child, and then yet more from his aunt-in-law, his uncle's widow, Alice de Lacy, Countess of Lincoln. I think I once worked out that Henry of Lancaster owned lands in 34 English counties. So, it would actually be probably easier to name the counties where he didn't own lands than where he did.
Well, he had something like 5 earldoms. I mean, that's just greedy.
Yeah, he was at first he was Earl of Lancaster, Leicester, Derby, and Lincoln. Yeah.
Salisbury. And Salisbury.
Yes, right. Yeah, you're right. It was 5. That's just ridiculous, just totally greedy. And then Henry of Lancaster also played a huge role in Edward III's wars in France and Scotland, and therefore he made another massive fortune from the ransoms he collected. So he captured a lot of noblemen and knights in battle, and therefore was allowed to ransom them, which was like an accepted part of warfare at the time. So made himself just enormously wealthy. So Henry of Lancaster had 2 daughters. There was Maud, who was probably born in 1340, so was exactly Gaunt's age, and Blanche, his younger daughter, who was probably born in 1342, or maybe 1343. And John of Gaunt married Blanche of Lancaster in Reading Abbey in May 1359. And there's still an inventory, which is now in the National Archives in London, of the wedding presents that the royal family gave to Blanche on this occasion, which is lovely. As far as I remember, it's mostly like gold rings and gold cups, like that kind of thing. So John of Gaunt married Henry of Lancaster's younger daughter because the older daughter, Maud, was already married to a German nobleman called Wilhelm von Wittelsbach, Duke of Bavaria, who was actually one of John of Gaunt's German cousins. So he was one of the sons of the Holy Roman Emperor. Incidentally, John and Blanche's first child, who was born a little bit over 10 months after their wedding, and she was called Philippa after her grandmother, the Queen of England. So they started producing children almost immediately after their wedding.
And it was her birthday yesterday.
Yes, it was. Yes, thank you much. Well remembered, Sharon. You have a great memory.
Although this isn't going out for a few months, so everybody will go, how did you work that out? It's like, no, yesterday, as in the 31st of March.
Yes, that's very great. So according to English inheritance law of the 14th century, like Maud and Blanche were their father Henry's joint and equal heirs. So if he had had sons, then the eldest son would have inherited everything, by the law of primogeniture. That was how it worked. But primogeniture didn't apply to female heirs, who were always entitled to equal shares of an inheritance. And there's evidence that actually Henry of Lancaster had another daughter called Isabella, who was older than Maud and Blanche, but she must have died in infancy, whereas if she'd survived into adulthood, then the 3 daughters would have inherited a third each of the inheritance. But as it was, Maud and Blanche were entitled to half each. And Henry of Lancaster died actually not all that long after John and Blanche's wedding, relatively young. He was about 50. And it may be that he died in the second great pandemic of the Black Death, because the plague returned to England in 1361 after a 12-year hiatus. But, I'm only speculating there. I don't know that for sure. So John of Gaunt and Blanche of Lancaster therefore took the share of Henry's lands in the north of England and some of the Midlands. And John's sister-in-law, Maud, was granted Henry's lands in the south of England, the rest of the Midlands, and in Wales. And one of the properties assigned to Maud in 1361 was the Savoy Palace in London, which is now closely associated with John of Gaunt. So Henry had inherited it from his father and grandfather, but with his wealth, he turned what was probably a relatively modest manor house into a massive palace. And some of the castles which John and Blanche took over at this time were Bolingbroke in Lincolnshire, where their son Henry would be born a few years later, Kenilworth and Warwickshire, Pontefract and Pickering in Yorkshire. Even with just half of the Lancastrian estate, John and Blanche were now really wealthy people. But then something unexpected happened. John's sister-in-law, Maud of Lancaster, died in early April 1362, only a year after her father, and only in her early 20s. And she and Wilhelm von Wittelsbach had no surviving children, so therefore her sister Blanche was her sole heir, and inherited at this point her sister's half of the Lancastrian inheritance. So at this point, John and Blanche therefore took possession of the Savoy Palace. So now that they had the entire Lancastrian estate, John's father made him the second Duke of Lancaster in November 1362. So at the age of just 22, John was now one of the richest men in England, and in fact possibly the richest overall. And he and Blanche throughout the 1360s had several more children after their first daughter, Philippa, the Queen of Portugal. So they had Elizabeth, who later married one of Richard II's half-brothers, and then Henry of Bolingbroke. They also had two sons who died young, and possibly another daughter as well. So Blanche spent a large part of her married life in the 1360s pregnant. And like her older sister Maud, Blanche died pretty young in September 1368 at the age of probably 25 or 26. And it was once believed many years ago that she died in 1369. People got the year wrong, and they therefore assumed that she had probably died of plague, which returned to England again in 1369. But in fact, she died in 1368. So given how regularly she was pregnant, she perhaps died of something pregnancy or childbirth related. But again, I don't know for sure. Her sole heir was now her only living son, Henry of Bolingbroke, who was only 18 months old when he lost his mother. But there was a custom in England in the 14th century called the courtesy, or the courtesy of England, whereby a man who married an heiress was entitled to keep all her lands for the rest of his life, even when she died before him, but only on condition that they had children together. So as the widower of Blanche of Lancaster, but equally importantly, as the father of Blanche's children, John of Gaunt therefore was entitled to keep all Blanche's lands for the remaining 30 years of his life. So if John and Blanche, if they'd had no children, let's say, maybe perhaps if one of them had been infertile or whatever reason, then after Blanche's death in 1368, Gaunt would have had no claim at all to any of the Lancastrian lands, and they would have been shared out at that point among Blanche's cousins. And just to put John's income into perspective, he earned around £12,000 a year. And his next youngest brother, Edmund of Langley, who was barely even 15 months younger than Gaunt, only had £500 a year, which was later, I think, in the reign of Richard II, raised to £1,000 a year, but was still only a fraction of what John of Gaunt had. So I think Gaunt's huge wealth and privilege, it was almost certainly a large part of what made him so terribly unpopular. I think this kind of wealth and privilege, it kind of probably tends to be like envy and resentment. Although to be fair, it was just by chance. Nobody had planned that he was going to be quite that wealthy. So I think that was a big part of it. And I also wonder if there was perhaps something in Gaunt's own personality. Like, I feel like his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, was this kind of wildly charismatic, heroic kind of figure who knew how to make himself beloved to the masses. And I think, John of Gaunt just didn't have that ability for whatever reason. He maybe just had a quieter, more introverted personality that meant he wasn't able to connect to the public like his eldest brother was. I mean, some people are like that, aren't they? Their true personality only comes out in private with people they like and trust, and they don't really connect particularly well to other people. I mean, from what I've examined of Gaunt's life, his letters, his register, and everything I can read about him, it kind of strikes me that he was actually probably quite a bosom companion, and the life and soul of the party, in private with people he knew really well. Like, for example, there was one occasion in the early 1370s, I think it was, when he met his French cousin, the Duke of Anjou. and his German cousin Albrecht of Bavaria, who was the guardian of his older brother Wilhelm. And it just comes across to me that these three men of really similar age had this really brilliant time together. Like John was like a real party animal when he let his hair down, but there was just something about this kind of personality which didn't come across to the public, and just made him, unfortunately for him, this widely detested kind of character.
Mm.
I wonder whether it was his wealth, particularly, was sort of heightened by the difficulties that ordinary people were facing in that period as well, after the Black Death and the Statute of Labourers and so on, all
Absolutely.
the sort of pressures on the lower classes particularly. And there you have this man who is so ridiculously wealthy that he would almost have to be hated.
Yeah, I think you make an excellent point there, Derek. Yeah, absolutely. Because the 14th century in England was, really not a great time to be alive if you're a commoner. There was this massive pandemic of the Black Death at the end of the 1340s, followed by several other great outbreaks of the Black Death. And you mentioned the Statute of Labourers, Derek, which Edward III's government kind of rushed out in 1349, which forbade anyone asking for higher wages than had been, the norm before the Black Death. So nobody could benefit from this sudden shortage of labour. And then earlier in the century, of course, in the 1310s, there'd been the Great Famine. Which killed off quite a lot of the population. So there was all this, famine, terrible disease. There were Edward III's great wars in France, the start of the 100 Years' War. So there were quite a lot of, old soldiers who were, maimed, perhaps couldn't work, had to beg for a living. Of course, there was no social welfare back then. So I think it was just a really difficult situation in England and, Europe more generally, anyway. And then, of course, early in Richard II's reign at the end of the 1370s and start of the 1380s, the government then made everything worse by introducing the poll tax, which was so everyone in the country was kind of taxed at a flat rate, which meant that a labourer who was earning like, 2 pence a day, if that, would then have to pay the same amount of poll tax as John of Gaunt, who was probably like a multi-billionaire by our standards. I mean, the whole thing was ludicrous. So, you can hardly blame people for being really angry and distressed about this and actually kind of, wanting to lash out at this hated figure.
Now, another part of him, and this is, I think Richard II had this idea, or Richard II's closest advisors who saw John of Gaunt as, the boogeyman. Because he was more powerful than them and richer than them and probably more intelligent than them. They always seem to think that he had designs on the throne, whereas when you actually look at his actions, he more than protected the throne for Richard II. So did he have any designs on the throne?
Just to explain the background of this a bit, Sharon. So John's eldest brother, Edward of Woodstock, the Prince of Wales, had been born back in June 1330, as the heir to the English throne. But then, unfortunately, he died in June 1376, like a week before his birthday, his 46th birthday, and a year before their father, Edward III. So this kind of left England, I suppose, in kind of like somewhat of a crisis, because the Prince of Wales' only son was Richard of Bordeaux, who was only 9 years old at the time. And I suppose perhaps in John of Gaunt's mind, he might have thought, well, as the eldest, at this stage, he was the eldest living son of Edward III, because his older brother Lionel had died back in 1368, like before he even turned 30, just leaving a single daughter. And perhaps he kind of thought, like I'm an adult, I've proved myself in war and politics, like perhaps I would make a better king than this 9-year-old boy. But it seems like Edward III was just absolutely sure that his grandson Richard of Bordeaux was very much definitely, his heir and his successor. And several months after the death of his eldest son, Edward III, therefore, he made his will. And he also kind of set out the order to the succession. So he wanted Richard to be the next king. And then he wanted John of Gaunt to come after that, as his eldest living son, followed by Edmund of Langley and Thomas of Woodstock. Edward actually kind of missed out the descendants of his second eldest son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, Lionel had only had one child, Philippa, who was born in 1355, actually, when Lionel was only 16, actually. Philippa married Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, and gave birth to 4 children quite regularly throughout the 1370s, and died early in her cousin Richard II's reign. But her eldest son was an heir, was Roger Mortimer, heir to the earldom of March. So he, of course, was then the senior descendant of Edward III's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence. And of course, like this fact that there were descendants of Edward III's second eldest son was going to create huge problems in the 15th century. So, of course, in 1376, nobody knew that was coming. And so when Edward III set out these rules of succession, and I suppose in a way it's quite interesting that he kind of seems to have ignored his granddaughter Philippa of Clarence and her children. So perhaps this points to John of Gaunt, exercising some kind of control over his very, elderly and ailing father at this point, or maybe it was just Edward's own wishes. It seems beyond doubt that John of Gaunt was actually Richard of Bordeaux's male heir, and he was probably considered like, the presumptive heir to the English throne, after Richard II, in preference to Roger Mortimer. But it's a bit difficult to tell because, the succession to the throne was a very touchy and dodgy issue throughout Richard II's reign, because Richard never fathered any children. And he had no siblings, or let's say no legitimate full siblings who lived past childhood. So this was always like a question, throughout Richard's reign. Now, is the real heir to the throne Roger Mortimer, or is it John of Gaunt? And I do find it interesting in 1376, on 1377, because Edward III died in June 1377, a year after his elder son, that he didn't appoint a regency council to rule for his nephew, Richard of Bordeaux, Richard II. And a few years ago, like Edward's biographer, Professor Mark Ormrod, suggested that this was because he trusted his son, John of Gaunt, and knew that John would do the right thing after Edward was dead. And to be fair to John of Gaunt, he did, he always supported Richard. That whatever he might have thought privately, and we can't really know that, he always did his best to do what he could for Richard. There's no sign that he thought of taking the throne in 1377. So he definitely did do the right thing. But at the same time, we do know that John of Gaunt was deeply ambitious. Later in his life, when he married his second wife, Costanza of Castile, who was the rightful heir of Pedro, the king of Castile and Leon, and John tried to gain the throne in Spain unsuccessfully. But so we can kind of see that he would have really loved to be a king. He never was. But so I think he might, in his heart of hearts, have had designs on the throne, but he didn't act on it, which I think is says something quite positive about him, because with all that wealth and influence behind him, he might have been able to make a reasonable bid for the throne. And primogeniture, the eldest son to the eldest son, was kind of a relatively recent development in English history. So if we go back to 1199, for example, when King Richard the Lionheart died, and he had no children, and there were 2 possible candidates for the English throne. So Richard's youngest brother, John, and their nephew, Arthur of Brittany, who was the son of John's older brother, Geoffrey, who had died many years earlier. And actually, John became King of England. So if John of Gaunt had been alive 200 years earlier, he would probably have become King of England.
Yes.
But because, after King John and then his son Henry III, his son Edward I, and so on, the throne of England had passed from father to son. And it seems that by 1376, this was so ingrained or, entrenched in people's thinking, that it doesn't really seem to have occurred to anyone that John of Gaunt, as the eldest living adult son, might be preferred to the child of his dead older brother.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because you just think when it was King John's turn, the argument was that the son of a king was closer to the throne than the grandson of a king through an old brother. Like you said, primogeniture wasn't established then, and Henry II had made sure to that it wasn't established then by keep changing his mind about who would be his heir.
I think that that's a good point you make, Sharon, about being the son of a king, because I think this is the problem perhaps that Richard II had, even if it was only a mental problem, that he was not, he was the king of England, but he was not the son of a king, whereas his three uncles, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, and Thomas of Woodstock, were. And of course, like he wasn't a king, the son of a king, because his father died before his father. So it wasn't anyone's fault. But he might have thought, that perhaps in a way that they are kind of closer to the throne than I am.
So do you think he would have approved of his son Henry taking the throne from Richard, as he ultimately did?
So John of Gaunt's son and heir was Henry of Bolingbroke, who was almost exactly the same age as Richard II. They were born only 3 months apart, and like John of Gaunt, his relationship with Richard II, it kind of waxed and waned. There were times they got on great and they were really bosom buddies, but there were other times it was like, Richard almost wanted to have Gaunt executed. And then this kind of then carried on to the next generation. So, like Henry of Bolingbroke or Henry of Lancaster, of course, was royal, was Richard's cousin. And I think, his biographer, Ian Mortimer, has kind of pointed out that he wasn't given nearly as many, perhaps, appointments or as much influence as, perhaps he should have been given that he was, the Lancaster heir and was royal. So Henry and Richard, I think, were exact contemporaries and had, I think, it was always quite a difficult and troubled relationship. And then in the autumn of 1398, Henry had this big falling out with Thomas Mowbray, the Duke of Norfolk, and they mutually accused each other of treason. Richard told them to kind of sort it out with essentially a duel, like a jousting tournament, near Coventry. But then at the last minute, he actually stopped the joust and exiled Thomas Mowbray for life from England for life. And in fact, Mowbray died only a year later in Venice, and exiled his cousin Henry for, well, originally it was 10 years. So it might have been reduced to 6. But I think this kind of just broke, John of Gaunt's heart that, his beloved son and heir had been banished from England, and John died only, what was it, 4 months after this. I think, I think just this knowledge that his nephew, who he had always done everything he could to support, had, banished his beloved son from England. I think it just broke him. So John died in February 1399, so about a month before his 59th birthday. And then poor Henry, who'd gone to the court in Paris, the French court, the court of Charles VI, who he was warmly welcomed. Couldn't even go to his father's funeral. So John was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral next to Blanche of Lancaster. And then a few months later, Richard II made this, what seems in hindsight to be an incredibly foolish decision, and left England and headed over to Ireland to sort out a problem he had over there. And Henry then took the opportunity to return to England, supposedly just to claim his Lancastrian inheritance, which Richard had also made this entirely stupid error of confiscating before he went to Ireland. So Henry had been banished, he'd been deprived of his entire massive inheritance, and he came back to England, supposedly just to ask for what was his to be restored to him. But then he was kind of overtaken by massive popular support, including by the Percys, the Earls of Northumberland. And he basically, and of course, this is quite a long, complex story, but in September 1399, he ended up forcing Richard II to abdicate his throne, and Henry of Bolingbroke or Henry of Lancaster therefore became King Henry IV of England. So what was it, less than 8 months after John of Gaunt died, his son was now suddenly King of England, and Richard II died some months later in Pontefract Castle, presumably murdered. What would John of Gaunt have made of this whole situation? I think it's beyond doubt that he and Henry were incredibly close, that father and son, really loved each other and always supported each other. So, it's hard to say, really. I think, by the end of his life, I think John must have just was so broken and so devastated by what his nephew had done to his son that, perhaps, after everything, that perhaps John actually would have applauded his son taking the throne. And
because with John of Gaunt, who was the heir presumptive, let's say, with him being dead anyway, was the heir presumptive Henry Bolingbroke?
Yeah, I mean,
effectively?
this is a great question because, Roger Mortimer, the grandson, who's the grandson of John of Gaunt's older brother, Lionel, he'd actually died. He was killed in Ireland in 1398. And then his heir was Edmund Mortimer, who was just a young child in 1398. So who actually really was the heir to the throne at the end of the 1390s? Was it this child, Edmund Mortimer? Was it Henry of Bolingbroke? And there's evidence actually that
Or
Richard kind of like favoured his next uncle, Edmund of Langley, and like actually skipping over both Lionel of Clarence and John of Gaunt, and then going to the next son. So it was all kind of quite complicated at the end of the 1390s.
I saw a suggestion yesterday or the day before, and I'm not sure. It might actually have been one of your posts or
Yeah.
somebody else that Edmund had been made keeper of the realm when Richard left for
Yes.
Ireland, and the keeper of the realm is usually given the appointment given to the heir when the king leaves the country. So
Yeah.
it was a tacit recognition from Richard that actually Edmund of Langley was the heir as far as he was concerned.
Yeah,
Yes.
except he couldn't have made Henry keeper of the realm because he'd banished him anyway.
Because he
So
wasn't
he didn't
there.
have much choice, really, did he?
No.
I think actually by this point he'd actually banished Henry for life as well,
Yes,
supposedly, as well as
Yeah,
calling
yeah,
he
him.
had.
yeah.
Yeah. Crazy.
It's like it just comes across to me as just petty and petulant and childish.
Oh,
Well, yeah.
yeah. Very much so, I agree.
I've always thought with Richard II and Henry IV, because like you say, they're contemporaries, they were born within a couple of months of each other.
Mm.
And I think their first wives also died within a couple of months of each other, didn't they?
They did actually, yeah. There was this time in 1394, just this very short period of several months where, well, firstly, John of Gaunt's second wife died, Constanza of Castile, the Duchess of Lancaster. And then Richard II's Queen Anne of Bohemia died, very suddenly and quite shockingly at the age of 28. And then very soon afterwards, Henry of Bolingbroke's first wife, Mary de Bohun, died also very, very suddenly. So yeah, there was something weird in England, and these three ladies all just died very, very, closely together.
Yeah, and you just think their lives were so intertwined from a very early age, but you get this feeling, this impression that Henry was given more of a chance to actually grow up and become who he wanted to be and Richard was cosseted, and you get just that Richard might have been jealous of the freedom
Mm.
and the training Henry had of because he was champion jouster as well, wasn't he, Henry? He was he was everybody's all
Yeah.
English, everybody's all American type person who could just turn his hand to anything and was really good at it and had friends everywhere. And
Yeah, I think, Henry was, I mean, at least, until 1399. I mean, after he became king, it was different. But, in his youth, he was unlike his father, he was wildly popular, he was this like, by the standards of his time, he was a much more conventional English nobleman than Richard II was, like the jousting and
Mm.
and then he fathered four sons and two daughters, also in a relatively short space of time, whereas like Richard II and Queen Anne actually had no children
yeah.
for whatever reason.
So I think that rivalry's been there since the cradle.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely agree. Yeah, definitely. Because they were both grandsons of Edward III. It's just, I suppose, from Henry's perspective, just Richard was lucky enough to be born as the son of the eldest son, and he was only the son of the third son. So I think, yes, there was probably envy on both sides, I would imagine. Yeah.
But speaking of that, I don't think the same kind of relationship existed between the brothers, did it? Between John of Gaunt and Edward the Black Prince and Lionel of Antwerp. They seem to have been more supportive of each other than their sons became.
I think it's actually kind of quite remarkable that the five sons of Edward III and Queen Philippa who lived into adulthood, they were always close to each other and mutually supportive, and they always supported their father as well. And I think this perhaps says quite a lot about Queen Philippa's interpersonal skills, and they were just always a very close family, and like You know, going back through English history, like it was so normal for the heir to the throne to kind of rebel somewhat against his
Mm.
father, you know, like in some respect, you know, like Edward III himself, you know, was in France with his mother, Queen Isabella, and actually invaded England with her in 1326 against his father. But we don't see any of that with Edward III and his sons. And I just think they were all a very close family. So although there were 10 years between John of Gaunt and his eldest brother, the Prince of Wales, there's evidence from the Prince of Wales accounts that in the early 1350s, so when John was like, you know, 10, 12 years old and the Prince was 20, 22, that they actually shared a household for a long time. And seems to have been very close. With Lionel, it's kind of hard to say. There's no Lionel and John, because you know Lionel kind of died relatively young, you know, before he even turned 30. But there's certainly no evidence that they weren't close. And then, you know, with Edmund, I think John was always good friends. And, you know, I think Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, is a somewhat underrated figure of this era, because he actually like stayed on really good terms with Richard II, you know, right till the end of his reign, which I think actually took some doing. And, you know, he should get more credit from that than he actually does. And of course, like these three brothers, they, you know, Lionel, John, and Edmund, they were all very, very, very close in age and had grown up together. Although it's kind of quite interesting, actually, that that Edward III made John of Gaunt Earl of Richmond when he was only 2 years old, and then arranged his marriage to the great heiress Blanche of Lancaster, whereas Lionel wasn't given a title, but he was married as a child to another great heiress, Elizabeth de Burgh, who was Countess of Ulster, and was also a cousin of Blanche of Lancaster. So he had that to look forward to. But then Edmund of Langley didn't receive a title until 1362, when he was already 21, when he was made Earl of Cambridge. And he was the only one of Edward's 5 sons who didn't actually marry an heiress. So he married the younger sister of John of Gaunt's second wife. John of Gaunt's second wife, Costanza of Castile, was like the rightful heir to her father, King Pedro of Castile. And her younger sister, Isabel, therefore wasn't the heir. I think he was a bit hard done by there, but having said that, I don't really sense any great envy or resentment towards John. And then Thomas of Woodstock, because he was 15 years younger than John, I mean, he was practically young enough to be, you know, to be John's son. So it's hard to say any real closeness. And I think they were probably quite different characters, but it, you know, again, I think they were mutually supportive and, you know, possibly affectionate, if perhaps not the greatest of friends.
You've mentioned 2 of John of Gaunt's wives, but obviously there's a third woman in his life as well.
Yeah.
And his various loves have attracted a lot of attention, shall we say.
Yeah, so after Blanche died in September 1368, John waited. There was another 3 years until he married again, and then in September 1371 he married Costanza of Castile, who was one of the daughters of Pedro, King of Castile. And to say that Pedro's love life was irregular is barely even scratching the surface. So Costanza herself and her younger sister Isabel were born illegitimate to one of their father's mistresses. He had numerous mistresses and numerous illegitimate children. So actually, when Costanza's mother, Maria de Padilla, a Castilian noblewoman, was pregnant with her, Pedro had married another woman, a French woman, a year before that. And then while Maria was pregnant with Costanza, despite already being married, Pedro then went through a wedding ceremony with another woman called Juana de Castro, and then abandoned her the next morning. So they only ever spent one night together, but this one night resulted in a son called Juan, born 9 months later, who was only 6 months younger than his half-sister Costanza. So this is the kind of background that Costanza came from. So she married John in 1371. So she was 17 and he was already 31. And of course, he was a widower and a father. So they were practically from a different generation. And I think, you know, that of course their marriage was a political one. You know, they were both the children of kings, and it gave John a claim to the throne of Castile and Leon. And I feel like, you know, he probably respected Costanza. He certainly admired, you know, her royal birth. They might have got on perfectly well as people. But yeah, I think it's quite clear that you know, John didn't feel any passion for his second wife. So then comes this woman called Catherine Swynford. Kathryn was the daughter of a Hainaulter who had moved to England after the marriage of Edward III and Philippa of Hainault in 1328. So the marriage of John's parents in 1328 brought a lot of Hainaulters to England. So Kathryn's father was one of them. And she had a sister called Philippa who married the poet Geoffrey Chaucer. And Kathryn herself married a knight of Lincolnshire called Sir Hugh Swynford and had, I think, at least 2 or 3 children with him. They obviously knew John of Gaunt and Blanche of Lancaster quite well because John and Blanche owned a lot of lands in Lincolnshire, including Bolingbroke. And Kathryn Swynford first appears on record in 1365 as actually one of the members of Duchess Blanche's household, and looked after perhaps like John and Blanche's daughters, Philippa and Elizabeth. Hugh Swynford died in November 1371, which, as chance would have it, was just 2 months after John of Gaunt married his second wife. And when I was looking through Gaunt's register a while ago, I noticed that there's this sudden flurry of entries relating to Kathryn Swynford in John's register in May and June 1372. So she had been mentioned in it once or twice before, but suddenly in a matter of weeks, we have 6 mentions of her in his register. And I think this is significant. So I think that about 6 months after Kathryn was widowed from Hugh Swynford, that she and John began their relationship. And this was clearly, I think John loved Blanche of Lancaster dearly, but I think possibly, his relationship with Kathryn Swynford was like the great passion of his life. So they began a very serious and very long-term relationship, and they had 4 children born in the 1370s. The Beauforts, 3 sons and a daughter. And just under 2 years after Costanza of Castile died in 1394, John of Gaunt actually married Kathryn Swynford and made her his 3rd wife and the Duchess of Lancaster. And this was really kind of amazing because, Queen Anne, Richard II's first wife, was already dead by then. Until he married his second wife, Isabel de Valois, later in 1396, Kathryn Swynford was actually the first lady in England. So, this Duke's mistress would suddenly become like the Duchess of Lancaster and the first lady in England. So it's a truly remarkable story. And I think this is where it's kind of attracted a lot of attention, for powerful, wealthy men in the 14th century or at any time in history, probably is, it's never been unusual for them to have outside lovers and illegitimate children, but to actually marry one of them was practically unheard of. And Richard II actually was very fond of Kathryn Swynford and gave her a place at court, but some of the English ladies were really disgruntled about it and refused to have anything to do with her. And then, of course, back in the 1950s, there's a famous novel that we all know of called Catherine. She's like one of the most, probably like the most popular historical novel ever written in the English language. And of course, I think many of us have read it, and many people know of it. And this brought the story of John of Gaunt and Kathryn Swynford to life. And it truly is a remarkable story.
But there was a practical reason for them marrying as well, wasn't there? And I do wonder whether or not it was the main reason for them marrying, which was to legitimize the Beaufort children.
Yes, I think that was certainly a major factor, Sharon, absolutely. And it may well have been the main reason behind the marriage, because, of course, the Beauforts were all born in between about 1372, 73 and 1379. And, of course, they were illegitimate. So their parents getting married in 1396 therefore made them legitimate. And this immediately and drastically increased their fortunes, because now they were the legitimate children of the Duke of Lancaster. So the only daughter, Joan Beaufort, at this point married the widowed Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and then they had numerous children who included, the Duchess of York, who was Richard III's mother, the Duchesses of Norfolk and Buckingham. So, and then one of John of Gaunt and Kathryn Swynford's granddaughters actually became Queen of Scotland, later on. And of course, like the Beauforts were massively important and played a really huge role in English political life in the 15th century. And if they'd remained illegitimate, of course, like none of this would have happened, or not nearly to the same extent. So I would imagine that John's wish, yes, to legitimize his children was a really massively important factor in his shocking decision to marry Kathryn Swynford. I think also, he just did really genuinely love her. She does strike me as, I mean, I like Kathryn Swynford a lot. I
Mm.
think, she was a remarkable woman. She strikes me as, quite magnetic, intelligent, charming. And, you can, I think, and John was just wildly attracted to her and passionate about her. And I mean, and to be fair to him, I mean, I know it doesn't sound very nice that, he'd had this long relationship with her while he was still married to Costanza of Castile. But like given the background that Costanza came from herself, I don't think that she would have been shocked by it or
Yeah, that's true.
not necessarily even bothered by, like, yeah, she was born illegitimate after her mother died and her father's legal queen, Blanche de Bourbon, died. Pedro claimed that he'd actually married
Mm.
Costanza's mother, which he hadn't. It was a lie. But then Costanza then she was legitimized. And then throughout her childhood, her father was taking numerous more mistresses and providing with lots more illegitimate half siblings. And her uncle, or her father's illegitimate half brother, became king of Castile, was Enrique of Trastamara. He and several of his younger brothers also fathered numerous illegitimate children. So, given this whole background, I don't think Costanza was
Mm.
particularly that bothered about it. So she and John only had one child together, or at least one child who survived infancy. There is evidence they had a son as well, but they did have one daughter together called Catherine or Catalina of Lancaster, who later became queen consort of Castile and Leon.
Yeah, and she married Enrique of Trastamara's son, wasn't it? So,
Grandson, yeah.
so it's like joining all the family together.
Yeah.
And I do think it's telling actually that is it Henry the Fourth after he became king mentioned was talking about Catherine and called her my lady, the king's mother. So it's not that she was.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, yeah, I mean, I think he was very fond
Mm.
of Catherine, but he did refer to Costanza like that as
Mm.
well. So I think it was just, yeah, it was kind of
Mm.
conventional, that your father's wife was your
Yeah.
mother.
Mm.
So like he had two stepmothers, Costanza and then Catherine. So he called both of them his mother. His mother, also actually his mother-in-law. So Mary de Boon's mother
Mm.
was Joan, Countess of Hereford. He called her his mother as well. So to a point, yeah, it was conventional, but
Mm.
I think, Henry of Bolingbroke and John of Gaunt, they spent so much time together as father and son throughout the 1390s. I think it would be obvious if
Mm.
Henry had disapproved of Catherine and his father's relationship with her. And I just don't see
Yeah.
that.
And he certainly had a way of, he had the facility to not call her
Absolutely.
his
Yeah, oh,
mother
absolutely.
and, to show his
And I
disapproval
think,
when he
back
became
in,
king,
yeah,
if he did.
absolutely. I'm sure he would happily have done that if he'd wanted to. And I think there was this time back in 1390, I think it was, when Henry went on crusade somewhere, possibly to Prussia, with his
Yeah.
half brother,
Mm.
John Beaufort, who was the eldest son of John of Gaunt and Kathryn Swynford, but also with John Beaufort's half brother, Thomas Swynford, who was Catherine's son by her husband, Hugh Swynford. So I think, these men do seem to have been close. Like there was no reason for Henry
Mm.
of Bolingbroke, to go on crusade with Thomas Swynford, his father's mistress's
Mm.
son, unless he actually wanted to. So I think, he was quite close to the
Mm.
Yeah.
family. Yeah, absolutely.
And when John was forced to relinquish Catherine after the
Yeah.
peasants' revolt, it was Henry's
Yes.
wife's household that she and her daughter Joan moved into.
Yes, they did, absolutely. So Mary de Boon back then, she was, I think, really instrumental in maintaining contact with Catherine and
Mm.
her children and, keeping in touch with them. Absolutely.
Must have made for some interesting Christmas dinners.
Is it perhaps that in modern times we tend to be sort of almost falsely moralistic about some of these things that
Yeah.
in the contemporary time they would have just seen as part of life. That's how things work. And as you say, the fact that someone was a half brother or vaguely related to your mother or whatever didn't
Yeah.
phase them as such. It wasn't a moral
Yeah.
issue for them. It was more of a personal issue almost as to if they got on with them or not.
I suppose, like, John would have seen, like his father Edward III had a very happy marriage with Philippa of Hainault. They were one of the great royal English marriages of the Middle Ages. But then, later in life, around late 1350s, early 1360s, then Edward III began a relationship with a woman called Alice Perrers, with whom he had 3 children. And there's also perhaps evidence that John of Gaunt himself had an illegitimate daughter, but when she was born, I don't know. As well as the Beauforts, I mean, he had another.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to keep track,
crazy.
isn't it?
Yeah. So overall, do we love John of Gaunt, or do we hate him? I mean, is he someone that we should regard highly or be a bit doubtful about? What's your take?
I'm very fond of John of Gaunt. I mean, of course he had his flaws, like we all do. But having read a lot of his letters, his register, having read all his incredibly long will, I find him to have been someone who was incredibly generous and kind to people he cared about. I mean, his family and his children, but also his servants. Like. I like generous, kind, loyal people, and I think John was loyal to a fault to the people he loved, and I find that something about him that's really likable, and like unlike his older brother, the Prince of Wales, he doesn't have a reputation as a warrior. Like the Prince of Wales first fought in the Battle of Crecy in 1346 when he was 16, and is famous for that. But what is much less well known is that John of Gaunt first saw military action when he was only 10 years old. So this was at a naval battle in 1350, and he was actually on the same ship as his brother, the Prince of Wales. So this battle is called the Spaniards on the Sea. It has quite a creative name. So there was this Spanish, or partly Spanish, partly French nobleman called Carlos de la Cerda, who was essentially a pirate in the English Channel, who would rob English ships but then throw the sailors overboard to drown. So Edward III decided to teach him a lesson and lay in wait for him in the Channel. And it actually worked. He actually defeated Carlos, and John of Gaunt was actually part of that. As a 10-year-old. So if his older brother is famous for seeing military action at 16, I don't see why John can't be praised for seeing military action at the age of 10.
Yeah, I always feel that, particularly with medieval figures, that the modern world has a kind of image of what that person was like. And it isn't very often an accurate image, but it's almost impossible to shake it. It seems to get into the psyche somehow. I mean, John of Gaunt isn't really, I wouldn't think he's a particularly popular character with modern people.
No, I think other than that dimension, as the long-term lover and then the husband of Kathryn Swynford, which of course people like because of the romantic aspect of it, then no, I don't think he is particularly well liked. And I do find this very interesting, like which figures from history are kind of, do become popular and widely known about, and which ones don't. There doesn't always seem to be a great deal of rhyme or reason to it.
No, that's true. I mean, you often now you think, oh, he was just in the shadow of his older brother all the time. But when you look at what he did for his older brother's son, if it wasn't for him supporting Richard II, Richard II may well have lost his throne at various periods during his reign before he lost his throne.
Yes.
So John of Gaunt is like this stability in a period of great instability after the death of Edward III, and yet he doesn't get recognised for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, after his, massive unpopularity earlier in his life, and especially in the 1370s and early 1380s, towards the end of his life, Richard II's reign was so turbulent and dramatic that, John of Gaunt by this point was, I think, pretty well seen as like an older statesman who was actually creating stability or doing his best to, where otherwise there would hardly be any. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much, Kathryn, and thank you so much for joining us today. It is always an absolute pleasure talking with you, and you know so much about John of Gaunt. Of course you do, you wrote a book. But thank you, I've learned an awful lot.
Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me, both of you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, it always is. Huge thanks to Kathryn Warner for her insights into John of Gaunt. Do join us next time for a special edition episode looking at some of the reading recommendations given by previous guests so that we can give you a summer reading list. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can get us on all your favourite podcast providers as well as YouTube, and you can subscribe. And please, if you've got time, we'd love to have a review from you as well. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.